Welcome to ESF Connected. I'm Kate Walker. Today we continue our sustainable series with the Center for Sustainable Materials Management with a discussion on bioplastics and the research that's being done here at SUNY ESF. Joining me today is Dr. Bandaru Ramarao of the Department of Chemical Engineering, and Ram, who we're going to call Ram today, is leading a project that looks into converting using waste materials, fibrous materials, into bioplastics. So Ram, so glad that you could join us today on ESF Connected. Welcome. And I'm going to hand it right over to you and to tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing. Thank you, Ram.
Thank you, Kate. It is a pleasure to be here this afternoon. And hello, viewers.
Hello. No comments yet. No one's chiming in yet. But this is a reminder that if you're watching live, we will be taking questions and for Ram today. So feel free to chime in.
Yes. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you, to discuss with you about some of the really exciting and interesting research that we're doing under this project, trying to look at waste fibers and some possible ways of valorizing them. That means trying to derive value out of them, trying to upgrade them into products that are useful, that are a little bit future looking. Hopefully we'll meet in the future where we have these wonderful products that help for a sustainable living, to improve the sustainability of our society with nice new products.
Right. Okay. That's the goal.
Yes.
So you have some slides for us today. Are you going to share some with us?
I'd like to talk about waste, or what are called waste recycled fibers. And it turns out that in most municipal solid waste streams, as well as some particular industrial waste streams, fibers tend to occupy a fairly prominent part, sometimes as high as, for example, 40% of the waste tends to be these fibrous materials. These could be discarded paper products, packaging products, or whatever, which for whatever reason didn't make it into the recycle stream. There are several reasons for why they don't do it. But for whatever reason, they didn't make it into the stream, into the recycle stream, but we could pull them out, and then we can make some interesting products out of them. Okay, so that's what I'd like to talk about.
Okay, great.
That's what this project is focused upon. And another or a key impetus for this project really came from the idea that, well, there are two ideas actually. One is that there is a substantial amount of waste material, fibrous material, that is generated from paper mills, particularly paper mills which are producing recycled products. For example, if you take your box board or boxes which come, a substantial amount, sometimes up to 60 or even 70% of the fibers in that have been recycled. They've been through at least one cycle, maybe more.
Okay, great.
And the paper mill, which actually makes these paper out of which the boxes are made, it turns out that it can't obviously use all the 100% of the fibers that it brings in. Okay. And there are practical reasons why it can't do that. A certain amount of it is indeed rejected into the waste stream. Okay. That amount tends to be sometimes substantial, and the idea is that, that amount, those fibers are actually, they present a lot of interesting opportunities. They are biomass. They are friendly carbon. I'd like to call them environmentally friendly carbon because they came out of trees. They didn't come from 8 miles underground from the fossil fuels of petroleum. So they don't impose an additional carbon burden on the environment itself. They are basically the same carbon going round and round.
Great. I like that. Friendly carbon. I'm going to remember that. All right. We're going to use that, make it famous.
So that's one thing. The other thing is that you can actually take this thing which otherwise would have ended up in a landfill, okay, and then you could make what we would call them as biodegradable bioplastics. We use the bio word twice in there for a particular reason. First thing is that the bioplastics, this is a class of plastics that have come into prominence, although they've been made for about 100 years. They've been known for 100 years, and they're made, interestingly, by a variety of bacteria, okay, and other microorganisms. And nowadays there are other interesting things trying to do. People are trying to make plants to express these bioplastics, and a lot of interesting things. So what we're trying to do is make these bioplastics, and the interesting thing about the bioplastics is that they're also biodegradable. So what that means is, if you throw them out into the environment, for example, you could compost them, or you could even just leave them in the environment, and then they oxidize naturally. They just go into carbon dioxide and water, or water vapor. So it kind of breaks apart for you.
So that's different than the current bioplastics that are out there right now, is what you're saying.
Yeah, current plastics
Yes.
out there, definitely, because you've seen pictures of that, and all these huge amounts of ocean plastics,
Right.
for example, plastic wastes in the ocean.
Yeah.
Marine wastes, and also you've seen pictures of how badly plastic affects plastic pollution, affects the environment, the birds, the animals, and so on. And also, there are issues of microplastics, concerns about microplastics, and so on. So bioplastics can be part of a good sustainable solution for the future. And that's really what our takeaway is, or our focus is. So our impetus for these projects really comes from the idea that perhaps what we can do is take these fibers, which actually present a resource, a useful resource, and convert them into sustainable products in the future. That's the whole idea.
Yeah, that's great. It's exciting. Terrific.
So the kind of, our focus has been particularly, as I mentioned before, on industrial waste, particularly paper mill waste. The history of our department is that we have been involved in educating and doing research in paper science and engineering. We were the paper science and engineering department for the longest time. We have what is the nation's oldest paper engineering program, or paper science program. And we have been investigating and been involved with the paper industry for quite a long time. Okay, so we're looking at wastes that are generated from different kinds of paper mills, particularly recycled board mills using old corrugated cartons, which OCC is a short for. And also tissue manufacturers. If you've used tissue, you will notice that tissue contains a lot of fine particles. And in fact, when you're making tissue, there is a lot of these fine cellulose particles that are hanging around in the atmosphere, in the environment. One of their problems is to treat that properly. Okay. There is a substantial amount of wastes that are generated, cellulosic, fibrous, fines waste that are generated in tissue mills too. And interestingly, they have very interesting, very soft, very good quality to be converted into various kinds of bioplastics or downstream conversion.
So
They are
tissue
particularly
waste can also be
yes,
a bioplastic.
absolutely.
That's
Yes,
exciting. Okay.
absolutely. And then, of course, what is known as fine paper. Fine paper is basically all the other paper that you see, like the paper you write on, the books, and so on, and any other specialty grades of paper. All of these things, you can draw the fibrous components out, and then you can do the conversion. So that's the whole idea that we're looking at. Okay.
Yeah, the university, just to break in, at the university and working in the community is, one of the challenging questions that we get, and we didn't chat about it last week on Recycle Right, but one of the challenges we get a lot are, what do we do with outdated books that we don't want anymore? So you're saying that type of material, that paper could be
Sure,
used.
sure. Although, the paper itself, what you could do is you could recycle the paper itself to make new recycled paper. That's what
Right.
you would do
Yeah.
normally.
Yeah.
But then when you do the recycling, an interesting thing happens, okay? Whether it is paper itself or whether it is your boxes that your Amazon stuff comes in, okay? And
I don't know anything about that.
and the interesting thing is the following, the fibers that come through, and then you take them and then you make a new box out of them. But as you keep doing this, making the paper again and again out of the fibers, it turns out that each time obviously you have to take the fibers and then you have to slush them in water and then make your paper and then dry it. Okay? Each time you dry your fibers, these are natural materials, and
Yeah.
each time you dry, they become brittler and brittler.
Okay.
And as they become brittle, the fiber, it has two properties. It tends to break apart, become small particles. The second thing it does is, because it is brittle, it doesn't bond very well. So the strength of the sheet that you make goes down. Now, when they are trying to make the paper for you, they compensate for that by adding a lot of starch to make the fibers bond together better. Okay. And not only that, you make it go through the cycles, and the more number of cycles it goes through, it tends to break up into these small fragments, and these fragments generally have a negative effect on the paper in two ways. One is that these fragments, they kind of interfere with the bonding in the sheet, and when they interfere with the bonding in the sheet, they reduce the strength, so now the paper maker has to overuse the amount of starch.
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing is that they interfere not only with the sheet itself, but they also interfere with the process. So one of the key things when you make paper is you got to make it in a water state, that is in suspension state, and then you got to remove the water. Now, when you're removing the water, the rate at which you remove the water depends upon, the amount of stuff there is in it. And obviously, the more of these fibrous fine fragments you have, the harder it is to remove the water. Okay, so that slows down your machine, and that impacts your productivity. Okay, so because of these two problems, okay, if you're able to, imagine you're a paper maker and you're trying to optimize your resources and to make the best product you can, and you want to make the most of it.
Yeah, you want to be
Okay,
efficient.
and that's the way that you go to a economically sustainable and also environmentally sustainable product that you have. Okay, now if you want to do that, what you want to do is you want to be able to remove these small interfering particles so that you gain the boost in your manufacturing capability, but you also gain the boost in your product strength. And the third nice benefit you have is that you don't need to use as much starch.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
which is actually good in two ways, because one way is that the starch, you pay less for it.
Yeah.
But the other also interesting thing is most of the starch that you put in, it actually goes out into the waste, into the water. And then it poses a load. It increases the biological oxygen demand. It causes microorganisms to grow. And the less of it you put out, obviously, better for the environment. So you have all these benefits.
Yes.
If only you were able to take these things out,
Right.
and then imagine you could make a bioplastic out
Right,
of it.
right.
Okay,
So-
so you have a really nice solution. So that's really what we're trying to do. Okay.
So before we move on, just a quick question for the viewers. If I'm recycling this cardboard, how many times in this general process that we're using now, how many times can that you're talking about reuse? Is it 5 times?
Generally, they say that a fiber, people have done this before, and earlier research indicates that a single fiber can go through approximately 7 cycles
Okay.
of recycling before it kind of breaks apart and kind of is not usable
Great.
anymore.
Okay. Terrific.
So what kind of recycled fibers are we talking about? And there are, as I said, one class of them is the industrial waste that I mentioned in my earlier slide. There could also be what I put in quotes, actually, what's called non-recyclable waste, and that's because This is generally understood to be non-recyclable, although technically it's not. Technologically, it is possible to recycle these things. However, it is possible for a variety of reasons, for example, supply chain issues. For example, you may be generating a lot of waste, let's say pizza boxes or something, in a particular area where a recycled mill which can handle these pizza boxes is not available. Maybe the mill that is there or the user of the recycled paper that is there doesn't have the technology that can actually deal with it. In that case, you have an effectively non-recyclable waste paper.
But it
although in reality,
is recyclable. So this
Exactly.
is one of the things, and we talked about this a little bit last week on our show with Recycle Right. And what we're trying to build through the center is recognizing that it's not that this material isn't recyclable. It may not be recyclable in your community and your location because of the lack of technology or the ability to do it on the back end. But we know that this is a resource, and this material can certainly be recycled, even if it has some greasy cheese on it. Even we've learned that whole
can be done.
conversation was actually not true.
Yes,
All
that's
along
right.
we
Yes.
could be
Yes.
recycling that.
Yes.
So you heard it here first. So in addition to pizza boxes, there were a couple other bullets there on your list.
Yes,
You had-
what is called coated stock, that is basically paper that is very glossy, and you can see that there is a layer of maybe some coating on top of
is that
it.
usually wax
different-
or other?
Well, that is for food grade.
Okay, yeah.
But then there are, like your book papers, like your, let's say the annual reports of companies which come in these very fancy,
Glossy, fancy
glossy things.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Magazines, for example,
Okay.
like Architectural Digest or
Yeah.
Vogue magazine or something. Okay.
So those materials can also be
They can
used.
also be. The only problem there is that you got to split between the mineral component, which is the coating itself, and then the fibers which carry the minerals on which you print.
Yeah.
So that's really what you got to do. Again, it's a technological limitation.
Yep.
Another thing is I wanted to mention for you is that sometimes just shipping these waste paper long distances may also not be economical.
Yep.
Earlier it used to be, to give you a good example, I think one of the big things that happened over the past 2 or 3 years is that China stopped receiving a lot of waste paper and recycling that, and that led to a crisis all over the world, that actually in the United States.
2018, yep.
Right.
National
So
sword.
that's an example.
Yeah, okay.
So, and then of course there are paper plates and cups and such, which again technically can be recycled, but then you may not have the facilities or something like that, in which case you could convert those fibers also into various kinds of bioplastics. So that's the whole idea.
Okay, great.
So, like I mentioned to you earlier, when you're making paper and then these fibers go through a recycling process multiple times, and this repeated recycling shortens the fiber, and eventually they reach a certain size where then they're called rejects or they're called fines in the industry. And these are the ones that are problemsome. Okay, a lot of times the paper maker tries to derive the maximum benefit out of them, but they can't really not reject a certain portion of them. And typically that's not a small amount. For example, a recycled liner board mill makes a single paper machine mill probably makes 1,000 tons or of that order per day. Okay.
Oh, wow.
So every day they pull out 1,000 tons,
Yeah.
maybe 600, 700, 800,000 tons per day. Okay.
Yeah.
And then there are many mills or many locations, companies which have multiple paper machines, in which case they may be making of the order, for example, in Solvay, New York, the company makes almost 2,000 tons per day.
Wow.
So when you're making paper on that large scale, you are going to reject a certain amount, okay, which is not insubstantial, which is not inconsequential, of the order of maybe 100 to 200 tons per day, depending on the condition, situation, and so on. Okay, so that's a significant amount of resource that can be converted. Imagine that you could make just, on the ideal conditions, not all of that obviously is fibers, but then even if you could make 50 tons per day of bioplastic or something like that, that could,
Yeah,
that could
game
have
changer.
that could have
Yeah.
a very good impact. Okay, so that's the whole idea.
Okay. Excellent.
So we asked ourselves, to give you a brief overview of what is the valorization process for wastes like this. Okay, what is possible? And the paper mill waste, for example, what you could do is you could take the waste and you could hydrolyze it. And once you hydrolyze it, that means basically slushing it in water, maybe adding a few chemicals, enzymes, under buffers or something like that. And if you did that, what you would get is you would get a lot of solid residue. The solid residue being all these minerals that I talked about earlier, the coatings, the fillers that are there, and maybe some plastic pieces and things like that. Those things you could take them out, and then the solution part, which actually would contain sugars primarily. Okay, it's the sugars that you focus upon to convert them into useful products. So what you could do is you could ferment sugars, and these sugars actually they have some very interesting and unique characteristics. Okay, that is special to them. So because of that, okay, this actually, our position is that it presents a really useful resource that can be used. Okay, what could you do with sugar solutions? People have done fermentation to make a variety of bioproducts. For example, it's a spectrum that I show on the left hand side of this slide. And on the right hand side, of course, all the other things that you could use the solid residue for. There are some uses that are currently being used, for example, animal bedding and so on. But then there are other uses too. The interesting thing about the solid residue is that typically from paper mills it contains some calcium carbonate, so it could be useful in some ways, and clay, so it could, both of those could be useful components. Now let's coming back to the aqueous or the suspensions or the solutions themselves, what you could make out of them. You could make various kinds of acids, for example, acetic acid or something like that for industrial uses. But interesting, and you could also make biofuels, which has been investigated actually. But the interesting thing now that we are talking about is to try to go into these bioplastics. That's really what we want to do. So our objectives in this is to look at the enhancement of sugar production. We have some variety of techniques that we've applied, and also we have some enhancements, and we're finding really interesting things that I will talk about, a couple of really interesting directions that I'll talk about shortly. And the other idea that we want to look at is, of course, sustainable conversion of these sugars into what are called these bioplastics, what are called polyhydroxyalkanoates. Now, ESF has a long history in polyhydroxyalkanoates. Our college has been investigating these bioplastics for quite a long time. Professor Jim Narcus in the environmental and now environmental biology department. He is a professor, emeritus professor now, and he investigated for a large part of his career. He investigated the varieties of bugs which do these conversions of polyhydroxyalkanoates, not from paper mill waste though, I have to say. That's our unique thing.
Yes.
But he did investigate that, so he investigated a number of bugs, and so there is some wonderful research that is available from ESF. And then after him, there was Professor Chris Nomura of the chemistry department, who was a well-known worldwide, a well-known leader in the microbes that are particularly engineered to produce different kinds of these bioplastics. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to take advantage of our history of ESF's location, whether it's in the paper industry, in the biology area, and in the biochemistry area, and coming together
Incredible
of these things
fusion of all these
to go
different
forward
expertise.
with very interesting new things.
Great.
So that's the whole idea of this research. So we actually divided our project into a variety of different silos, if you will, or tasks or subtasks, if you will. And we have a team actually composed of faculty members from our department along with collaborators from different places. And the of course, one of the objectives is to look at the to actually make these bioplastics polyhydroxyalkanoates, characterize them, and also study their biodegradability to see how well they perform as a sustainable product. The other objective, which is allied to this, which actually came with the idea from the industry itself, that perhaps a portion of these particles that are rejected out into the environment or into the solid waste, what they could do is, could we make them more amenable? For example, could we make them better bond so that you don't lose that strength of the sheet, and then you could use it within the sheet itself and basically use it more effectively, and that could also reduce the waste stream. So that's a twin objective, if you will, that one of my colleagues is investigating and trying to make them more sticky, if you will, these fibers, these fiber fragments. Okay, so that's the whole idea, that one secondary objective.
So going into just real quickly, when you look at, you're characterizing and looking at the performance of and the biodegradability of these, what does success look like in terms of the output? What is defined biodegradability for us? What is it?
One way in which you could do that is by looking at the if you take a certain amount of the bioplastic and then you followed with time how much of it goes away into the atmosphere, becomes CO2 and water, with time.
Right.
Eventually, it turns out that the bulk of it actually vanishes if you wait long enough. And I have a picture here which you will see, where you'll see a bottle actually, and that bottle is degrading, and eventually most of it goes poof.
Great, I can't wait to see
that. So the rate at which that goes, and how much is eventually left over, that could be characteristics.
Two major factors is time and what is left as waste.
Okay. So those are the kind of things that we would like to look at. The other thing, I'd like to introduce the team itself who's working on this.
We'd love to meet them.
And the team is basically, we have 4 graduate students, excellent graduate students, and I hope that you will get the chance to meet some of them as we go along and connected.
Certainly.
And we have 3 other collaborators along with myself on this particular project. All of them are faculty members in our department. Professor Deepak Kumar, Professor Changun Yu, and Professor Shiji Lu. Professor Kumar and Professor Yu are young assistant professors that we have just hired in the last 2 years or 3 years in our department. They come to this with a lot of expertise in bioprocess engineering. Professor Yu comes with a lot of expertise in lignin conversions and also in the area of bioprocess engineering and chemical engineering. And Professor Kumar is a bioprocess engineer who has been researching cellulose conversions. So he's been hired about a year ago. And he's working on different aspects of this project. And we also have Professor Shiji Lu, who's a worldwide, very well-known authority on bioprocess engineering. And also, he's going to be looking at a very interesting twist of recycling the plastics itself. If you've been following any of these plastics issues in the controversies, you will notice, or you would have heard of the concept that perhaps instead of taking these plastics and rejecting them into the environment, which is causing all these problems, one of the ideas that people have is that let's take this plastic and recycle the plastic itself. Okay. And there is some work on that, and chemical engineers are very actively looking at that right now. The American Institute of Chemical Engineers has numerous programs, conferences, and parts of conferences devoted to that question. Okay. So Professor Liu's idea is quite interesting. What he thinks of is, why don't we take these bioplastics and don't wait for them to biodegrade, but just take them and make them cycle around again. Okay? And that could actually work out where you
Yeah.
could take this bioplastic and imagine you had a shampoo bottle or something like that.
Right.
Okay, and especially the ones that you get in the hotels, in the hotel
Yeah.
rooms and so on,
Yeah.
those small ones.
Yeah.
And after one day you use about a half or a quarter of it and then you throw it in the garbage. Okay, and it kind of
Yeah.
goes there and sits in the ground for what, I don't know, maybe 1,000 years or even more, right?
Okay.
So the whole idea is, if that bottle was, let's say, made of a bioplastic,
Okay.
not only was it made of a bioplastic, but you put it in a recycle bin, in a special bin. And then you could take that, and you don't have to wait for about 3 to 6 months, which is typically the time that it takes for these things to degrade in the environment. But you could just take it, and within a week or so, you can melt it, and then you could hydrolyze it, and Professor Liu is developing processes for that. So you could make that same bottle again.
Great.
Okay, so
Wow.
that's the
Talk
whole
about building a circular economy.
Exactly,
That is
exactly.
incredible.
That's really is a
Yeah.
wonderful circular
Yeah.
economy. Okay, so that's an interesting idea that
Yeah.
he's looking at. And I have Professor Yu, who is looking at this whole concept of taking these fiber fragments and making them more bonding, okay, inside the paper sheet. By, one idea is just take this thing and put a cap, put a covering on it. The covering could be starch, a specially tuned starch. These have been used in the paper industry in other applications, or different other kinds of chemicals, do some chemistry on it. So that's what Professor Yu is looking at. And then I have Professor Kumar, who's actually looking at what are the technical and economic parameters in these processes, and how do they play into economic and also environmental viability of all of these products and processes?
Yeah.
When will they actually come into being, into play in the future? What kind of conditions do you need in order for them to be sustainable? So
Okay.
these are the kind of questions that he's
So
trying to answer.
is that like looking at what kind of infrastructure is going to
Yes,
be needed
that's going
for
to be a
this?
part.
Is
Absolutely,
that
that's
okay?
going to be part of it. Another part of it is going to be things like, okay, these are the inputs into it. These are the costs of the inputs, and then right now this is going to be the cost of the product.
Right.
Okay, but what is the benefit of this cost of the product? Supposing it is, let's say, $1 a pound, okay,
Right.
which is actually very competitive with the plastics market.
Okay.
We are not there as yet, I believe, but we could be there, as you probably know. Danimer is a company, it's a bioplastics company which has come on board very recently in a big way. There are a few others that are coming on board into the market with bioplastics.
Great.
There's a lot of interesting things going on. Fade is actually a bioplastic based straw that they're making.
Okay.
So it's
Yeah.
a plastic straw, but
Yep.
it's made of a bioplastic. So
Yeah.
that's called Fade, I believe.
Okay.
So that's another one.
Wow.
So
Alright.
these are the kind
Check
of
that out.
things.
Great.
Yeah.
It's exciting. All right. So we can move through.
Yes.
Do you have more slides that you'd
Yes,
like to
I
share
have a
with
few
us?
more.
Okay. Great.
This is a slide which shows you basically we investigated. This is a project that we've initiated. We're approximately a year into it.
Okay.
And one of the first questions, obviously, you're going to ask is, what is the composition of what you're looking at? How good is it? How much is feasible, and so on? So we found, of course, we knew this before going into, that there is a relatively high amount of ash in these fibrous wastes. Of course, it depends on where they come from. But then the interesting thing is this. The interesting thing is there is a substantial amount of useful biomass-like material, what we call as polysaccharides, okay? That is basically different kinds of celluloses or sugar oligomers, polymers, and so on, that are available within these fibers and within this fibrous waste, okay? And that is the one that keys in, because we feel that, one of the big advantages of why we are looking at it is that, the biorefinery has been talked about quite a bit, and people have talked, and at ESF we have investigated very heavily into the concept of the forest biomass based biorefineries, okay, to make biofuels and various kinds of other products, of course.
Great.
So the nice thing about the solid waste fibers or waste fibers is that they are just like a biorefinery input, that is a biomass. But then remember something, this is not wood, this is already fragmented wood. So you don't have to do the work in order to fragment the wood.
Yes.
Okay? That's a very big thing.
Yeah,
the other real big thing is, if you've seen wood, generally you'd say it is brown in color, and then it's got these components called lignin, which binds these fibers together.
Right.
The nice thing about the fibers that we have is that these are generally of lower lignin content. Okay. And of course, OCC, old corrugated carbon carton board fibers, have a lot more lignin. But the white fibers like tissue mill waste and all, they have very little lignin. And that's the beauty that I was telling you about tissues and such waste, is that they are so easily convertible into or hydrolyzable. So these are the nice things about the biomass itself. So as I said, the process itself that we are investigating is to take these fines and then hit them, brew them basically inside a vat or inside a reactor. There are different configurations of the reactors that we are studying, trying to optimize that and so on. And we use a cellulase cocktail. These are generally commercial, but then we have some twists added to them to make them particularly well tuned to different aspects of these feedstocks. Okay. And then we separate out the solids and the liquids, filter them essentially, and then we take that glucose or sugar-rich liquid, I should say, and we ferment that. Okay, we brew that basically into using different kinds of bugs. We have focused on an engineered E. coli, which has originated from Professor Chris Nomura's laboratory. And we actually, our students and our team has found very, very interesting twists on the application of these very interesting bugs that Professor Nomura and his group have created. Okay, so we take these things and then we make the polyhydroxy alkanoates. I put a B over there to show that we're looking at a particular product called a polyhydroxy butyrate. But our latest work is very interesting. We can actually make these copolymers. Now, I'd like to take a minute here to branch off to explain what I'm talking about. Okay. Now, the conventional bioplastics that people have investigated for a long time, okay, they do have some disadvantages or they do have some challenges. Okay. One of the challenges is that they don't work as well when you try to mold or put them in a regular plastics machine, primarily because they tend to be brittle and their operating windows for operation are pretty narrow, of temperature and other parameters. Okay. So what
they're a little more fickle.
Right, they are more fickle, exactly, exactly, temperamental.
Yes, I have one of those for children, but don't tell them.
So the whole idea is to make them, behave better.
Right. Okay.
So how would you do that? And again, this is an idea that has been known, that is investigated in the literature. Okay. And the idea is that perhaps we can take these butyrates and kind of marry them with either longer chain monomers like valorates and a whole bunch of others, decanoates and so on, or there are other things you could do. But if you do this thing, you do what's called a copolymerization. Okay. And what we found is that the E. coli that we are working with are particularly very, very uniquely positioned to take advantage of, to make these copolymers. Okay. And I hope that we can report more of these interesting things to you in the future. And
you will welcome
talk about that.
For sure.
Okay. So there are some very interesting things over there. That's what I want to say. So we made a lot of demonstrations of these bioplastics and their feasibility over the past few years, 2-3 years or so. And we've taken them, we've hydrolyzed them, we've fermented them. In an earlier iteration, we made what is called polyhydroxyalkanoates from a bacterium called B. cepacia, Burkholderia cepacia, which actually was used by Professor Gymnakis. He was the one who pioneered that, I would say. And then we made bioplastic that you see over here.
Got it.
I think over the next few iterations, we will show you some bioplastic films
Okay.
that you can see that were
That's
made out
exciting.
of these fibrous wastes.
Right.
Okay. So we've shown that these bacteria can actually produce these biodegradable biopolymers. And some key results, I'd like to just give you a taste or a flavor of the interesting kind of things that are possible by suitably engineering the process itself, okay, so that you can, for example, increase the yield of the cells that are growing the bioplastic by almost 2.4 times. And you can also increase the bioplastic inside the cell by almost 4 times. Okay. So here is a nice picture that I think one of the students took. I will show that picture in a minute. The other thing is, as I mentioned to you earlier, you could make these very interesting copolymers that have better properties that you can form films or whatever products that you want to make out of them. Okay. You can make those things, and the kind of copolymers we have demonstrated with are a copolymer made out of a dual feedstock, that is the actual feedstock of the fibrous waste, but also some organic waste maybe, okay? Some fatty acids, for example. And again, this is things that we will talk about in the future.
Yeah.
Okay. So these are the very interesting new types of polymers that are possible. Okay.
Yeah, that's very exciting.
This is a picture of these bugs themselves and them carrying the bioplastics, those pearls that you see inside them, kind of like oysters and the pearls inside them, although numerous amounts of them. Those are the bioplastics. And you can see that there is a large amount of bioplastic in each of them, which is kind of a very unique thing. It kind of surprised us, and when we investigated that, we found out the reason why. And we think that the paper that's going to come out of that is going to tell you why and under what conditions that happens, and that's going to be a whole very interesting thing.
Yeah, it's super
So
exciting.
there are a lot of interesting and exciting things about this research, about both scientifically as well as the ability to have an impact on sustainable living for the future. That's really what's exciting.
Yeah, well, it's we know as all of these conversations that we've had so far, we certainly recognize that there's incredible waste still going to landfill, and recognizing that this is a resource, and to be able to utilize this for a bioplastic is super exciting. And do you have a couple more slides for us, Ram? Or
that's the last one. The last one that I wanted to show you was what you mentioned right in the beginning about the circular economy. Okay. And this slide shows to you what the concept of the circular economy is and how the bioplastics form a very interesting part of the circular economy. Okay. So, for example, you take woody biomass. You take a tree, for example. I know, I mean, it's not the greatest thing to do mentally, of course, but then there is an issue of sustainable management of the forests, for example. Okay, you want to manage forests in a very responsible way. Sometimes there are good reasons why you want to cut the undergrowth and things like that. Okay, so you have sustainable forests, you make paper out of them, okay, in a very sustainable way. Remember that paper is a sustainable product, okay? It doesn't use any petroleum, any fossil fuels, technically. In fact, the energy used to make a lot of this paper itself comes from the wood, okay? So a large portion of it. The other thing is that you reject a lot of this into the waste that you see over here. This is a picture of the waste. That is the waste. That is what presents an economic and an environmental burden. You do that, you'd make a plastic out of that I have shown in this vial at the bottom here. And from that plastic, you make a bottle. maybe a shampoo bottle or
Yeah,
whatever it
yeah,
is that you see.
Yeah.
And then you can let that bottle degrade.
Yes.
That is what you see over
Yes.
here. Okay. And once it degrades, the CO2 goes back into the
Yes.
atmosphere and it gets captured by the tree, and then it
Yes.
makes its cycle again.
Right back.
So
Yep.
that's where you have the circular economy.
Yes.
Okay. So that's the concept of the
Yes.
circular economy. And within this concept, we have our own twist that Professor Liu is looking at.
Right.
And that is the idea that, you use the product right here on the right hand side, and then you recycle the product.
Yes.
Okay, you make
Yep.
a hydrolysis, you make your original bioplastic monomer, you polymerize it, and then you make your bioplastic back again.
Yep.
So you basically have a cycle within a cycle.
Right.
Okay.
I love it.
So would it be doubly circular?
Yes.
Okay. So that's the whole
That's really
idea.
exciting.
So, so this is what I have.
Great. Okay.
And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great.
And,
Well,
know,
yeah, certainly. Well, thank you so much, Ram, for that incredible
Sure.
presentation. And now that I've heard it a couple times, every time I learn something new. So it's incredible.
Well, me too. Every
There you
time we do this, first of all, it's wonderful to be working with a great team.
Yes.
Okay? And it's
Yes.
great to be working at ESF, which has a this long history of, it kind of gives you an example of how Professor Jim Nakas's work has played into this, Professor Chris Nomura's, and then all the work that different departments have been doing and are involved and engaged in the areas of sustainability and the environment particularly, okay, as we move into the future. I think that's very important.
Yeah.
The fact that we have a long history and also a long position, we come in with a lot of momentum,
Yeah.
scientifically speaking.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it's incredible,
this,
and being able to pull that knowledge in, and now under the center,
Right.
recognizing that the Department of Environmental Conservation, through their funding of the center, sees the potential solutions, so many of them, and are investing in this research. So. The research, just to clarify, we are funded under for 5 years, right? So I'm assuming that most of the work that you're talking about in this research is within that time frame.
Yes.
But
indeed.
it
Although
sounds
they-
like you'll have a couple of things that will potentially come in the next year or two, though, that we could bring you back in
Yeah.
and give an exciting update,
Yeah,
maybe.
absolutely, absolutely. I would love to talk to you about some of the really exciting things that are coming up. I would say both right now we do have to, iron out a few wrinkles here and there, but then, really make them nice. But also the things that are coming up, exciting things that are coming up on the horizon, okay, in this space itself.
Great.
So it would be wonderful. Yes.
Great. Well, we are super excited. And again, thank you, Ram, for
Thank you,
joining
Kate.
us today. And speaking of exciting things, next time, next week, at this same time, we are going to have Christopher Thomas, one of your students, your longtime students. We were
Yes,
talking
yes,
earlier
yeah.
in the show about
Yes.
Chris. Chris is a PhD candidate in the chemical
he's a PhD.
department,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And has been working with Ram for many, many years. He's going to come back next week and talk on ESF Connected about converting brewers' waste. So using brewers' waste into and making that into biodegradable plastic. So we're excited to have him come and speak with us next week. I hope that you will join us again next week for ESF Connected. And to see any past episodes, you can just check out ESF TV on YouTube. You can post questions there too. If you have questions after you watch it, we'll go in and check and answer any questions that you have. Make sure to subscribe to that. To Dr. Ram again, to Ram, thank you very much. And to all of you at ESF TV, I'm Kate Walker, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you very much, Kate, and it was a pleasure to be here.